My friends, this morning, I invite us to journey into the Gospel of Matthew, for what we find there is a very strange story. I don't know about you, but it seems almost fantasy-like, something that would come out of a fiction novel. There's a mountaintop experience, and all of a sudden, Jesus is transformed and glowing as bright as the sun, with his clothes as sparkling as light. And what more, it's not just what's happening with Jesus. There's these two figures who appear, Moses and Elijah, who have been dead for a very long time. And here they are standing with Jesus. And poor Peter, James, and John must have been terrified out of their wits. Wouldn't you? So what is this about? What's the core of what's going on here? In order for us to understand, I think, what Jesus is calling us to hear and experience, we have to do some cultural and historical background research. So we'll dive into that first. The first thing we need to know when approaching this passage is that mountaintop experiences are sacred. We look all throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and it's on the mountaintops that God meets God's people, that very miraculous, transforming things happen. We hear where this mountaintop experience with Jesus isn't the first. We hearken back in our first reading in Exodus to Moses himself, who goes up to Mount Sinai after leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the wilderness. And it's on Mount Sinai that Moses goes up, where there's this great cloud surrounding it, that God is present on this mountain. Note that there is a great cloud that descends upon the mountaintop in our gospel reading. There's a parallel with the God as cloud and on this mountaintop. And we don't get to it in the Exodus reading this morning, but if you journey a few chapters on, a few verses on, when Moses comes down off of the mountain, he too is transformed. We read that his skin shone bright as light, and the people of Israel were terrified. So we see there's this parallel with the mountains, with God's appearance in the cloud, and with the transformation when we've been in relationship with God. And a unique thing about Moses that we need to recall is that in this moment we read today, it's the beginning of the giving of the law to the Jewish people. This is where the 10 Commandments come from. Moses will come down with those 2 stone tablets. And so in the Jewish faith, and those of us here and Christians who inherit and continue this faith through Jesus, the 10 Commandments, this is the moment where the law is given to God's people. It is a gift. It is a moment of covenant making. So when Moses appears on this mountaintop, it's more than just Moses, the great deliverer, the one who led the people through the wilderness. It is evoking a remembrance of God's promise in the law, that God will be with us, God will journey with us, and that God is creating a new way of life. So we have a great pillar of the Jewish faith represented here. And then we have Elijah, who we don't read his story today, but if you look back in the Hebrew scriptures, he also has a mountaintop experience when he is combating the false prophets of Baal, one of the idols of the area in which he ministered in. And in the Jewish faith, Elijah is an important prophet, if not one of the most important prophets. This is one who proclaimed God's goodness, who called out for justice, for the hungry to be fed, for the naked to be clothed, for the homeless to be housed, for the nation of Israel to return back to their covenant with God, to remember the promise of love and justice that God brings forth. So not only with Elijah do we have the mirroring of the mountaintop and God and the clouds and the transforming but he represents the other pillar of Jewish faith that we gain God's wisdom and guidance from, which is through the prophets. He is emblematic of all the prophets that have come before. And so we need that background knowledge as we come to this moment on the mountain, because Peter, James, and John would know this history. This would have been a part of their upbringing. They would understand these promises and how God has spoken out. And to see Moses and Elijah with Jesus in this transfigured moment, combined with a cloud, with God's voice saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." It's nothing short but God drawing the connection that covenant is being fulfilled, that every word of the law and every cry of the prophets is being done, is being transformed. And we get a glimpse of it in its fulfillment with Jesus. Transfiguration Sunday, this transformation of Jesus is nothing short but a promise of assurance, a comforting balm that God offers to all of us and the disciples to keep going. That as we continue to walk this way of love and continue to be in covenant with God, that beloved world that we hope for, that we long for, that we are working with God for, will come about and is coming about. And to underscore the importance of how this is a moment of assurance for Peter, James, and John, we have to look back to the 16th chapter of Matthew. I'm sorry, y'all, this is a lot of history, but we need it to get into it, I promise. Because you see, in the 16th chapter of Matthew, this is a pivotal turning moment in Jesus' ministry. Up to this point, he's been going around and teaching, and he's been going around healing and feeding others. He's been performing miracles, and people have been gathering to this wandering rabbi, this teacher, and saying, "There's something different, there's something beautiful here, we wish to follow it." Chapter 16, Jesus turns his eyes to Jerusalem. And though the disciples aren't aware of what awaits there, we do. The cross, the crucifixion, and also the empty tomb, the resurrection. And so in the 16th chapter, Jesus is starting to lay this out for his disciples. Within this section, he names that Peter will be the one on which the church is built upon, lifting up the profound faith of Peter. And yet in the very next section, he's rebuking Peter because Jesus starts telling his disciples what will happen, what will be, that death will come, that it won't be an easy road to follow God's path. And Peter, similar to probably how the other disciples felt in this moment, "No, Jesus, why would that happen? Heaven forbid." And Jesus rebukes Peter, and then talks about how those of us who strive to hold on to our lives will lose it, but those of us who will lose our lives for the sake of the gospel, for the way of love that Jesus gives us, that we hear echoed in the law and the prophets all throughout history, we will gain our lives, new life. So you see, this transfiguration moment comes at a perfect time because the disciples are scared. They're afraid. Jesus is talking about death and uncomfortable things. And I ponder if we might also be relating to that too. When we continue to see the trials and the tribulations of our world, on how tiring it can be to be a loving presence, and how many of us are hitting compassion fatigue. I know I have hit that a long time ago. And in the midst of that for the disciples, in the midst of that for us, when we can just feel beaten down and unsure, or just going through the motions in some ways, the transformation of Jesus on this mountaintop is to share with us the hope that is being fulfilled. that God's way of love does win out. It is that promise that resurrection will happen. And that the road, yes, will be hard. And it will be long. But when we walk it intentionally with God across generations, across cultures and communities, the world is changed. The world is transformed. We have a hope that is promised and fulfilled to bolster us and carry us forward. Now, I don't know about you. I love that God offers this in this gospel, but I haven't gone around on a mountaintop recently and had Jesus and Moses and Elijah appear to me in some grand, miraculous event. Have y'all? We live on a mountain, maybe you have. But I ponder how God gives us promised assurance and reveals hope fulfilled in other ways in our lives, in the still small ways, in the subtle ways that we might miss if we're not aware. Where are those spaces where God is providing you hope today? Where are those moments in your life where even when you feel that you have given all that you can, you get a glimpse of what God is doing, and it fills your soul to the brim? I invite us to think on that and to hold on to that memory, because God gives us those to sustain us along the way. I call them God sightings. There are many times in my weeks when I will just be trudging through something and just all of a sudden there's this little tiny seed sprouted. And it's tender and it needs nurturing, but it fills my soul with hope because I saw who planted it. And I've seen how members in this community have watered it and nurtured it and invited God into that process, and to see it grow. That one little thing, it makes it all worth it. For me, where I experienced my little hope, my little growth yesterday was with my family. I've spent the last couple days making phone calls, conveniently organizing a family reunion, which we haven't had in years. And I won't go into it, but the short version is my family on that side is complex. There's a lot that goes into it. And there have been moments in time in my life where I have seen our family come together and pulled apart. And I've seen us have issue and crises together and arguments and disputes. And there have been times where I would not have thought this possible. And yet, in making those phone calls to all my aunts and uncles and all my cousins, every single one committed to that day. And there's about 30 of us. So that's a hard thing to get 30 people to agree on a day. It's a very small thing. But for me, that is an assurance, personally, of the power of God and the transformation that God's love can have. Because that might not have been the case for my family at one point, and yet I see where God has led us through all these things and how we've had to give up the life that we thought we might have in order to receive this new one, which is better, more fulfilling, more nurturing, more loving than could ever have been imagined. So how is God whispering hope into your ear today? Where is God providing you assurance that all things are being fulfilled, even if it's hard to see? And how can that whisper be a strength for us so that we may walk with Jesus in the way of love, that we may turn with him to Jerusalem, not as those with fear for the death that will come, but for those who walk with hope and joy for the new life that will come forth from the ashes. Amen.